briefly introduce him as I do for every guest speaker. Siddharth is an alumnus of Rishi Valley School, and he went back to the school to teach there after completing his MA in English Literature from Delhi University. And since 1991, Siddharth has been continuously teaching in KFI school, mostly at Rishi Valley, and for some time at Uttarkasi school, uh, which is not there anymore, and also Rajghat Based Center School. He is presently with us at Rajghat. He writes poetry. He is also a runner, and he is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation India. Siddharth is going to talk to us about another look at fear, freedom, and inquiry. As the format is, Siddharth, you can speak for as long as you want. And after you are over with your discourse, then I'll request Dr. Gajanan Rao to make some observations. And then we'll leave the open the floor for question answers. So this is the format we have been following. With these words, I'll request Mr. Siddharth Menon to please go ahead and deliver your talk. Mr. Siddharth Menon.
May I request to say some poem also during your lecture whenever you want it?
I think let's hear the lecture first, then there'll be poems.
Yeah, I think Dubeji asking me, giving me the space to speak for as long as I like is dangerous. But I'll try and keep my comments as brief as possible because I don't really think I have very much by way of insight to share, but I would like to raise some questions. But first of all, thank you, Dubeji, for introducing me, and thank you, Sushilji and others in the Indore study group for inviting me here. I can see it's a very lively forum. I've attended a few sessions, and it's a great privilege to be here again today. So thank you all. Now my topic is a little grander than I would have intended. Another look at fear, freedom, and inquiry. And so let me first of all explain how I came up with this topic. I was thinking that fear and freedom are two of the many issues that Krishnaji spoke about a great deal and are currently very much in our consciousness in times of the pandemic. And that's why I thought I would like to, perhaps help create a space for us to look at these things again. But as I was thinking about these themes, I thought that I should also like to take a step back and perhaps raise some questions about inquiry itself, about the nature of inquiry, and what it was that Krishnaji seemed to expect from the people that he listened, the people that he spoke to. And in fact, I'd like to begin with that. I'd like to make a few points about inquiry, then take a quick look at some aspects of fear and freedom, and then perhaps come back to the question of inquiry. Now, recently I was rereading after many years two talks that Krishnaji gave, the only talks that he ever gave in Washington, D.C. And these were very late in his life. These were the year before he died in 1985. And the talks have been collected in a booklet called The Structure of Our Being. And I have always found these talks very rich because they seem somehow like a somewhat comprehensive survey almost of everything that Krishnaji was speaking about all his life. Almost like a kind of summation in some sense. And he perhaps intended it that way since, as I said, it was the first time that he was speaking in Washington, D.C. And as it happened, it was the last time that he ever spoke there. And from these talks, I'd like to share with you 5 points related to this question of inquiry. And I'll come back to them again at the end of my presentation. The first is something that we'll all be familiar with. Quite early in his talk, he says, "This is not a lecture, but a conversation." And he says, we are talking over together. Now, this is something that, as we know, Krishnaji very often says at the beginning of a talk or in the course of a talk, that he is not in fact giving a talk, that this is in fact a shared inquiry. And it can seem a little paradoxical because in fact, you know, everybody else thinks of these as talks, and they are in fact mostly talks. Of course, there are also question and answer sessions, there are records of discussions, but most of these things that we think of as talks, including the Washington, D.C. sessions, were in fact talks. There was no to and fro, there was no discussion. And yet Krishnaji insists that in these talks, we are inquiring together. And I think that's interesting for what it implies about the quality with which we receive what he's saying. I don't want to say more about it, but I just thought I'd like to highlight this. A second point he says, and this is again something he often says, is he asks, can we inquire not merely intellectually, verbally? Can you inquire not merely intellectually, verbally, but with your heart, with your brain, with all your being, and find out why we are what we are? Now, I find that also worth pausing at. What does it mean to inquire with anything other than the intellect? I mean, we are used to obviously thinking about things, and thought is obviously an extremely valuable tool. We are using it right now for the moment, for instance. And yet, Krishnaji seems to say, can you look with your whole being? And I'm intrigued by that. What is it, for instance, to inquire not just with your brain, but with your heart? And I've sometimes wondered whether, given the vast amount of material we have available from Krishnamurti, the books, the videos, and so on, and of course the many forums we create for going into them, like this forum, whether we aren't skewing our inquiry too much towards intellect. I'm just wondering whether we give enough space to other modes of inquiry apart from those of the intellect, which isn't to say that understanding something intellectually is irrelevant or unimportant. That's not the case. Krishnaji also was using thought and the intellect. But what else do we have? And are we thinking about what else do we have? But that itself seems like a contradiction in terms. So let me just leave it as this question. How else can we inquire in addition to with the intellect? A third thing he says is, he says it's important to look at things as they are, non-verbally, if that's possible. Now, I find this particularly moving in some sense, because I remember from the time that I was a student at Rishi Valley when Krishnaji was still alive. It was the last few years of Krishnaji's life, and he used to visit school every winter. And in the talks that he gave students, one of the things that has stayed with me is in more than one session where he would ask us and ask students exactly this question. Can you look at something? Can you look at that tree? And can you not name it? And I remember as a child wondering, what does that mean? And the harder I tried to do that, the more difficult it seemed to be to do. It seemed almost counterintuitive. In fact, I remember 2 weeks ago when Dr. Kumaraswamy was speaking at this forum, he also raised this question of looking non-verbally. And I find that, as I said, intriguing. The fourth point is Krishnaji says, and this is all in the course of the first of these two lectures at these two talks in Washington, DC. He says it's good to ask questions, but he also asks, what do you expect when you ask a question? Are you expecting an answer? Is it just a matter of agreeing or disagreeing with the speaker? Is it then again implicitly another intellectual exercise? But he says, he goes on to say, begin to inquire into the question itself. And he seems to see inquiring into the question as being something different from giving an answer or even seeking an answer. It's almost as if he's saying inquiring into the question is itself the only valid thing that you can do with the question, to look at it, to look at it with all your being, not merely intellectually and so on. And the last of these points that I'd like to bring up, and this is again something Krishnaji often says, he says, if we actually perceive deeply, then there is mutation. There is change when you perceive something deeply. Now, this is again something that has intrigued me and has stayed with me. And I don't really think I'm any closer to understanding this deeply. That is not just intellectually. Intellectually, it's not very hard to understand. But I'm saying experientially, what does it mean to see something with such clarity that a change takes place? So these are the 5 points about inquiry that I wanted to raise. And at the end of my presentation, I'll come back to them very briefly, just to remind us. But now let me turn to the questions, the related questions, let us say, of fear and freedom. Now, and especially, as I said, in the context of a crisis like the current pandemic that we are all facing, the whole world is facing. Now, obviously, there are various kinds of fears we're experiencing. Some of them may feel new, but some of them just may be more obvious versions of fears that we experience at other times too, though we may not always be aware of them. So for example, to begin very simply, there's fear of falling ill, of catching the infection, of sickness, of hospitalization. There's a fear of death. And all of these fears may be both personal and for the people we care about. There's fear of financial ruin or financial hardship because jobs are no longer secure, the economy is less robust than we expect it to be. So there is, and this leads to a larger issue, which is this issue of uncertainty. I would say underlying all this is, I think we are not comfortable with uncertainty. You know, there's a poet, Eliot Sushilji asked me to bring in poetry, so I'll bring it in indirectly. Eliot, in one of his poems, says, humankind cannot bear very much reality. I'll just modify that. I think humankind cannot bear very much uncertainty either. I think we like to feel that we know the world. We like to feel that we are in control of our lives, in control of circumstances even. And suddenly something like this comes up, like the pandemic, and all those certainties seem to be built on shifting sand. And with this, there's also this fear that things will never return to normal. And you see, there is this longing to go back to a kind of status quo, to a situation that we are familiar with. And there's this fear that, you know, COVID is now here with us to stay. It may mutate. God knows whether these vaccinations will ever be effective. Maybe our lives have changed forever, and so on and so forth. We would be much happier going back to a kind of stable past that we are used to. Now, the interesting thing is, most of us would perhaps prefer that, even though we see the limitations of that normalcy. The thing that we call normal, we know that even in spite of normalcy, you know, our lives are not always being lived intelligently. We know that that the world is, the resources of the world are being overexploited and all of that. I don't need to go into the details. And yet, we would, at one level, whether we'd like to acknowledge it or not, somewhere there's this deep longing for things to go back so that it's almost as if this COVID never happened. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, what I'm saying may not be true for everybody in this room, but I would just say that by and large, this discomfort with uncertainty and this longing for what we know is, I would say, part of the human experience. In fact, there's a sense of a kind of disorientation. It's, you know, when I was living in Uttarkashi, I was there for about 5 years. And during one of the years, in fact, more than once, there were earthquakes. The Himalayas, of course, earthquakes you experience fairly commonly. And once it was a fairly big earthquake. And I remember the feeling I had after the earthquake. It was not so much fear, it was a kind of feeling of disorientation. Because the thing that we think of as being most stable in our lives is perhaps the earth we tread on. And when the earth itself begins to shake, suddenly your entire notion of what is reliable and stable and safe, it's all overturned. And you feel extraordinarily vulnerable. And so I would say COVID has had that kind of earthquake effect, I think, on the lives and consciousness of many people. Now, how do we respond to all this? Let me say at the outset that for some people, not everyone reacts to this negatively or unhappily. On a lighter note, I'd like to quote this English playwright. There's a well-known English playwright called Tom Stoppard, who a few months into COVID, he was quoted as saying, "This is the life I've always wanted, social distancing without social disapproval." So, you know, when society, when the situation is forcing you to keep away from others, and if your temperament is one that would like to keep away, nothing like COVID. You don't have to go out and meet people. You have a good reason to stay at home. Now, of course, that's just, as I said, on a lighter note, but it's possible that many of us have a sneaking appreciation of the opportunity just to be a little more on our own. Because, of course, you know, social life, though it's enjoyable, though it's rich, though it's necessary, can also take a considerable amount of our time and energy. But I would say, apart from what Tom Stoppard points at, there are deeper opportunities as well in a time like this, and I'd like to mention a few of them. One is that, Gopteji, could you mute your mic, please?
Yes, yes.
Guptaji, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Now, one is, so what are these other, let us say, deeper opportunities? One is, I think, simply recognizing that our sense of security, our sense of well-being is really like a house of cards that we've built. I think the fact being forced to recognize that all the structures we've created around ourselves in our lives are so fragile. You know, we have this illusion of security, of permanence, of stability, right? Even though somewhere, with or without Krishnaji, somewhere we realize that none of these things ultimately perhaps, you know, gives the deepest meaning to our lives. Even though we realize that, in a time like this, we are forced to recognize it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Another thing that happens is, in a time like this, the choices available to us become fewer and they're also unfamiliar. There are so many things we can't do that we would normally like to do. You know, we've lost many freedoms in terms of, as I said, socializing, travel, the many usual activities that we do. And we realize that the loss of these freedoms, the things that we took for granted, is unsettling. Now, that itself, I think, realizing that itself, I think, is of great value. Because it makes you begin to ask, what does freedom then really mean? If the loss of what I would call local freedoms is affecting us so much, how free were we? Isn't our dependence on those freedoms, the dependence that we've built up on having a lot of choice and so on, isn't that a kind of prison, right? So in other words, I think it's an opportunity to look radically at what freedom really means. We all know that for Krishnamurti, choice is not a particularly good word. So being in a situation where choices are reduced or taken away is not necessarily a bad thing if we are looking at the deeper question of inquiry. I think this whole illusion that choice and an abundance of choice is what makes us happy, suddenly we realize that that may not be true. We don't have them, and it's perfectly possible to live happily without them. Another thing that it does is that a situation like this brings us, I think, squarely face to face with the fact of mortality. And of course, we are aware of death, we think about it. And yet, I think more often than not, we look at it with a certain sense of distance. I think in a situation like this, one looks at it with a new energy. And let's remember that for Krishnamurti, again, looking at death is not at all a morbid thing. Far from it. On the contrary, in fact, in the same set of talks, in the second talk, he says, is it possible to live with death all the time? Now, I don't want to sort of, everyone here has read and thought about what Krishnaji is saying, so I don't want to try and paraphrase that. But it's just a reminder that living with death, right, in the way in which Krishnaji means it, is something that is seen as a way of living with intelligence, living intelligently, not living so caught in the past, right? Being able to die to that past from moment to moment and so on. And I would say that, again, COVID or a situation, a crisis of this kind can act like a catalyst. Finally, in terms of the positive opportunities of this, and there are perhaps many more, I've just identified a few, I think it reminds us, as nothing else does, that we are truly the world. You know, Krishnaji frequently says, as you know, you are the world. And again, intellectually, that's not a hard statement to understand. And yet I think that we hear the statement, but we don't quite believe it. I think somehow that illusion of being distinct and being separate and not being the same, even psychologically, as the rest of mankind, I think that illusion is very deep. And it's not easy to come out of it. But in a situation like this, you suddenly realize, you're forced to realize that you really are no different. And when Krishnji says you are the world, I think he was saying it primarily in two ways. One is, of course, you're no different from the world. Right? You're as susceptible to what the world brings to you as everyone else. Psychologically, you're the same. But the other is, and it's related to the first, you are responsible for the world. Your actions have an impact on the rest of the world. I think COVID shows both of these things very starkly. Everybody around the world is experiencing the same gamut of emotions, feelings, anxieties, hope, and so on that we are in this room. So there's no difference. And so you're forced to see this, and not just as an idea, but I think the actuality of it, but also the sense that you're responsible for it. Because to take it very simply, I mean, your irresponsibility can spread the disease very widely if you're not careful. And that's just at the simplest level. There are larger ways in which the responsibility we have for each other is brought out very starkly in times of crisis. Now, I've used the word crisis, and I'd perhaps like to end with a couple of questions related to crisis. I think it's worth remembering that for Krishnamurti, crisis is not at all a bad thing. On the contrary, I think he sees that in a state of crisis, when you see that the world is like a house on fire, which is of course the metaphor that he often uses, but to see it, to experience it, to feel that crisis is when something happens, when something moves. The fact is, we live with his teachings or with our own questions and so on. And one of the questions we are constantly confronted with is, why is it that we don't change? Why is it that we don't seem to see with the kind of intensity that brings about what he calls mutation or change? Right? It's possible that will happen, or there's a better chance of it happening when we experience our state of being as a crisis without labeling it as something negative. Here, by crisis, I just mean seeing something with a certain degree of intensity and seriousness. So, two questions about crisis. One is, and they're related questions. One is, why does it take a crisis or an apparent crisis for us to actually begin to see all of these things? That our lives are perhaps more cluttered and less free than we'd like to imagine, that there are other ways of living, that we are responsible for the world, all of that. Why finally does it need a crisis? How is it that when we have this sense that everything is all right in the world, we just carry on with things quite happily? And these questions seem to lose intensity. So this is one question. What is it about needing to have a sense of crisis for movement to happen? And the related question I have about this is, what happens when our sense that there is a crisis gets over? Either, to take the current example, somehow miraculously we deal with COVID once and for all, so we no longer feel its threat. We don't feel that there is some crisis that we are all facing. So what will happen then? Will our lives have been changed because of this experience of having been through a crisis? Or will we quickly scramble back to, the previous thing which we were comfortable with? Now, I don't want to speculate, But I just think it's a question worth asking. I think the pull towards the normal, and now there's a phrase that's increasingly being used in public discourse, the new normal, right? Where things which seemed unthinkable have now become the normal. It's almost a cliche now. Maybe we will just simply adjust to the changes that have happened in the world. I don't know. But I think it's a question worth asking. So just to repeat my two questions about crisis. First of all, why did it need a crisis? Secondly, once we think the crisis is over, what will happen to our lives? Now, it seems to me that the answers to these questions really lie in the initial set of questions which I raised about what we do with inquiry. Because I think those questions are an indicator of how serious we are, and also point towards the fact that there are other ways of going into fundamental questions apart from the intellect, apart from understanding things theoretically. So let me just quickly go over those 5 points again, just to remind everyone what they were. These points that Krishnji makes about inquiry. The first he says is, this is not a lecture, but a conversation. We are talking over something together. Dr. Parekh, I think you are unmuted. If you could just mute your, yeah, thank you. All right. So that's one. The second was, can you inquire not merely intellectually, verbally, but with your heart, with your brain, with all your being, and find out why we are what we are? So can inquiry go beyond the intellect? The third was, can we look at things as they are, non-verbally, if possible? The fourth was, it's good to ask questions, and we need to begin to inquire into the question itself, not merely seek answers about which we agree or disagree. And the fifth was, if we actually perceive deeply, there is mutation. So now, just to end, and this is again in response to Sushilji's request, I'm going to read you a short poem, and it's not my poem, you'll be happy to know. But I think poetry represents an alternate way of looking at the world, in which there's a dynamic between intellect and, let us say, response to the world. And the poem I'm going to read to you is a haiku, so it's very short. It's just a 3-line poem. And it's a 17th century poem from Japan. And I came across it just this morning. Somebody, my mother in fact, drew my attention to a short piece, a recent piece by Pico Iyer, who's a well-known writer. And he, at one point, he's reflecting on, what are our lives in times of a crisis like this. So it's interesting. I mean, my mother didn't know about this session, but it was nice to see this article just this morning because it seemed to tie in with what we are speaking about. So Iyer, among other things, refers to the fact that several years ago, his house, which was in California, burnt down completely. As you know, there are these terrible wild forest fires in California. So he lost everything, literally everything, the house and all his possessions, including notes for books that he was planning to write, and so on and so forth. So he had to start afresh completely. And he views that experience in hindsight as having been an enormously positive experience because he realized how little he needed. He also realized that having lost his notes for the books that he was writing, he would need to use his imagination and use his heart to recreate those things. And I think that's an exact parallel with what we've been talking about in some ways. If you take away the tools of intellect, it doesn't mean that we are left with nothing. And at the end of that piece, which he wrote, he quotes this poem, and this is how the poem goes. My house burned down. I can now see better the rising moon. My house burned down. I can now see better the rising moon. So, yeah, I think I've spoken for long enough. So I'd like to stop now and let's take it forward in any way. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddharth. Beautifully presented and some very important observations. I think you have also left us with lots of questions to ponder over. May I request Dr. Gajanan Rao now to make his observation, sir? So we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Is there any problem, doctor? Meantime, Dubey sir, you can ask Chidanandji. He has to leave at 11:55. If Dr. Gajanan can't speak, then.
Okay. So I don't see Chidan. Chidanji, would you like to say something, sir? Before we get back to Dr. Rao? Yeah.
I don't mind saying two sentences. The words that Siddharth shared with all of us have been really thought-provoking, and especially in the light of this pandemic, what appeared as a tragedy has been once more shown to be having positive sides. And especially I liked the point that this pandemic makes us realize that all of us, humanity, are one. While normally we cling to our special identity, separate identity, we have so many walls that our psychology builds between others and us. But the pandemic shows to us we are all now in the same boat. I should perhaps avoid the word now. We were in the same boat, we didn't realize it. Now we realize we are in the same boat. And lastly, I very much liked the two lines that were quoted from Pico Iyer, that we could see the moon better now when the house is burnt down. I think I'll remember that for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chidananji. Thank you. Dr. Rao, yes, sir. Can you talk to us now? I'm still not able to hear you, sir. I'm still not able to hear you.
Sir, meantime, Vijay Chhabda sir can say something, if you like.
Yes, Vijayji, would you like to say something, sir? You have to unmute yourself. Vijayji,
Yeah. Right. No, I'm saying I'm still in that, I have the snow peaks in front of me and I'm in the days of, just absorbing, and so I'll wait.
Okay,
And
okay.
Doctor,
Anybody else? Harshad bhai, you'd like to say something, or you have observation to make? Yeah. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Are you able to hear my voice?
yes, sir.
Okay. About inquiry. What is crisis needed for inquiry. The way I feel that what is needed is a tremendous curiosity to look at what is happening and intensity, honesty, and much more a kind of a silence to see what is unfolding within ourselves. And so Krishnaji says also, the freedom is not at the end, but it is at the beginning. That means, how do we read a book? How do we look? How do we listen? What is the quality of the mind which is looking, listening? And that seems to me the most necessary thing, to see not what Krishnaji has said and thinking about it, but forgetting all that what Krishnaji has said and looking inside and being very, very curious. It's like being in an empty room and somebody comes through the door and you know that somebody has entered. So that state of mind is required to see things clearly, directly, non-verbally. And that is, then we don't need, I feel, to read anything, because we can see clearly what is happening when there is a anger or fear or jealousy, anything which comes, then we can see it as it is arising. And that seems to me a kind of a freedom at the beginning. And about you are the world, we can explain that we are not different in quality like any other American or Chinese or Indian or Christian or Hindu, because we all think, and we think very similarly. But that is the intellectual understanding. The real understanding is the feeling that I am the world. That can happen only when our mind is very silent and we are looking, listening. In that, there is no sense of I or me arising, because this sense of I, me, it arises because there is thinking, and then it separates itself from the world. But when there is no thinking, no sense of I, then we are the whole, whatever is, because there is no sense of I. So this is what, and about the freedom also, that we carry a lot of burden on our head, inside our mind, and we may not be aware of it. But when that burden goes away and we feel something different, then we know that we were carrying a lot of burden. So the freedom is experienced only when so many burden which we carry, it goes away, and our mind is really free to look, listen, whatever is happening. And in that there is a newness, freshness every day. Okay, I have finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parekh. Dr. Rao? No, sir, we are not able to hear you. Your audio, some problem with the audio, I guess.
Dr. Rao, you could check if your headset is connected properly.
Maybe you can take it out and then try and talk to us.
Or
So
you can
can I
exit
question?
the meeting and come back and see
Yes.
whether it will restart.
So can I questions?
Somebody
can I
wants to? Yes, please, go ahead. Dinesh, please, go ahead.
To Siddharth ji.
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Sir, the crisis that we're talking about in our daily life, do the negativities only have to bring in the crisis features like fear, jealousy, anger? Only these are the times when the energy comes together and then we start looking at it? How was it, sir?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You see, the word, I think the issue is partly with the word crisis. It's partly a semantic issue. Because the word crisis itself suggests a situation that is difficult, problematic, and so on. And you see, in our usual lives, when everything seems to be going reasonably well, it looks as if we don't have the energy to look deeply. It looks as if we are usually quite content, and it takes, a blow on the head for us to sort of wake up. I mean, there's a simple side to this. It's just how we tend to neglect our health until we fall ill, then suddenly realize the value of health. Now, so to come back to the word crisis, the experiences you mentioned, fear, jealousy, hurt, those kinds of things. Those are experiences which are not pleasant when they arise. And when they arise, a couple of things happen. One is we would like to get over them if possible. Another is it makes us aware, it reminds us that we are susceptible to those feelings. You see, when I'm not currently in a state of jealousy or fear or hurt, I may sometimes have this feeling, this illusion, let us say, that I'm somehow invulnerable to those things. We have a kind of amnesia about the experiences we go through. I may have been upset about something last week. The whole thing has blown over. And now it almost seems to me that, that experience I had never really happened, or that I had just indulged myself. I could have really dealt with it easily, and so on. So when one of these things arises, as I said, it's like a wake-up call, and that's one way of looking at it. And if it's intense, it is what you might call a crisis, because you can't ignore it. It's there. And it seems to narrow your life in many ways, because of course, when, say a feeling like jealousy or whatever, when it's there, it possesses you. And it restricts your capacity to do the other things, to live with freedom, to relate with people, and all of that. So it doesn't let you go. Whereas your question was, is it only these negative kinds of things? I would say that these negative kinds of things are the ones that we tend to take more seriously, simply because they're unpleasant, like a headache or something. Of course, the positive experiences that we have, let's call them positive experiences, right? Moments of great joy, moments of discovery, maybe of insight, or feeling in harmony with nature. I'm sure we all experience those too. But probably we don't think about them as much, simply because they're not problematic. I don't know if I've addressed your question. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking aloud, but I think this is what my response would be.
Yes, sir. Can I continue with the query, sir?
Okay.
Please
Mr.
do, please
Toke.
do.
Hello.
Can I ask a question, sir?
मिस्टर टोके टोके सर, अगर गजानन जी को अनम्यूट कर सकते हो तो करें अपनी तरफ से। वो उनकी रिक्वेस्ट आ रही है कि मुझे होस्ट को बोलो कि अनम्यूट कर दे। इज इट पॉसिबल टोके?
वो तो अनम्यूट ही है।
पर वो बोल नहीं पा रहे हैं ना सर।
नहीं तो उनके कनेक्शन में कोई प्रॉब्लम है।
अच्छा, अपनी तरफ से कोई वो नहीं है?
हाँ, अपनी तरफ से कुछ नहीं। आप भी देख सकते हो ना, आप भी देखोगे तो सब चालू है उनका।
देख लिया है मैंने तो।
हाँ,
बाकी
वही
उसके
तो।
बाद उनका फोन आता है ना बार बार। उनका
समझ
फोन
रहा
आ
हूँ
रहा है
मैं।
मेरे पास। हाँ, कंटिन्यू। अभी तो उनका जो उनके पास 2 थे, अभी और पूछता हूँ उनसे, है ना? थैंक यू।
I'm going to
In the
call you.
meantime, can I ask a question?
I think meanwhile there was a follow-up question. So if we
Yes,
can
sir.
first hear that
Yes.
and then
Yes,
yeah,
please. Yes, please.
Go ahead, please.
Siddharth, I was questioning. The last question was mine. I'll continue, sir.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, if we are interested in certain things and we are very passionate about those things and we are following those things, it somehow turns in the entire conversation of me, I'm the world. It somehow is differing because it becomes a very linear movement where I'm pursuing my own interests and passions. Though I'm fully involved in it, full energy is put into it, the entire energy is gathered there. So what is this energy gathering all about when we are talking in respect to what Krishnamurti is talking about? The gathering of energy.
You mean the gathering of energy around something that you're deeply passionate about? Is that what you're saying?
The energy that Krishnamurti ji is talking about, and here we are following an energy which is a very personal, passionate, intent, with a lot of intensity that we are pursuing certain things, but somehow is very linear and is very individualistic.
Well, I would say it may or may not be. I think, you see, anything one does probably combines both of these things. On the one hand, it can become self-enclosed, individualistic, apparently linear, as you were saying. That's a nice word because it suggests something one is seeing oneself as progressing towards.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it can simultaneously include a quality of inquiry and learning. You know, when you're deeply interested in something, perhaps certain things you work towards are part of that journey. And there's the linearity, and there's also maybe a quality of self-absorption. But it doesn't seem to me that that excludes a quality of, let us say, non-linear learning, which may also happen. I would like to say that, you know, these things can happen together, and I think often do when one is doing something one deeply loves to do.
Agreed, sir. Agreed, sir.
So I hope that sort of addresses the question. I'm not sure.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Can I ask a question now, sir, to Mr. Menon?
Yeah. Yes, you can. I think Dr. Gajanan Rao is also audible now.
Shall I
Yes.
continue or shall he will
No,
speak?
go ahead and ask the question, and we can go back. Go ahead.
Sir, let Gajanan Rao speak first, please.
Yeah.
No, I feel Dinesh ji has a question, so I feel we should have that question.
Speak to them. I can hear them well. I tried to unmute, not unmuting.
Dinesh ji, please go ahead. Go ahead.
My question to Mr. Siddharth Menon is, referring to your all 5 points, how the deeper perception can change the fear? Will the fear go? You said that there will be some other instrument which we can use other than intellect. So what is that instrument? And what will happen to the fear? Whether fear will go completely or what change it will take place?
Headphone is there. I remove it now. I thought without it it's better, but then headphone
Okay,
is very nicely being
I
used.
don't feel like asking Dr. Gajanan Rao to mute because we may lose his voice,
There on the
but
picture there,
right now I'm
video
getting
में
distracted. Okay.
I've muted him. I've muted him, Siddharth. Please go ahead.
Okay, okay, right. Now, Dinesh ji, let me first clarify that, when I mentioned those 5 points, I was not saying those things. I was really just highlighting some things that Krishnaji was saying. And he was saying that if one can see with what he calls if you can see with what he calls your whole being, something changes. Now, I think, I could sort of speculate and give some sort of an answer to that, but I'm not sure of how much use that would be, because I would have to admit that it's not a fully real experience for me. This is what Krishnaji is saying, and I think it's very interesting. I would say that for me, as I mentioned earlier when I was reading that poem, that haiku, I think poetry is something that in which the intellect and, let us say, the non-intellect coexist. In fact, they have to. Poetry is by no means a purely intellectual exercise, but nor is it a purely experiential one either. They have to go together. So when I see that from my interest in poetry, I begin to sense something of what Krishnaji is speaking about. Of course, he is coming from perhaps a depth that I can't even fathom. And yet somewhere I sense that there's something here that perhaps I can connect with. So, so if you ask me what exactly will happen if one does this, I don't know. I can tell you what Krishnaji says can happen, or you can read it yourself. But I think finally one has to explore, if one is interested, what this non-linear, non-intellectual way of living, way of exploring might be. Because of course, what we tend to do is to rely very heavily on the intellect. And again, I'm not condemning it. I mean, it's there. I mean, we use thought all the time, and it's obviously useful. But I think Krishnaji is indicating that it's not the only way of appreciating the world or of understanding oneself, and that in fact, in the whole business of self-inquiry, thought ultimately cannot take us very far. I think that's how I understand what he's saying. And I think it has more to do with some of the things that Dr. Parekh was mentioning, a quality of silence, a quality of listening, and so on.
Savita ji has been raising her hand for a long time. She wants to ask something. Savita ji, please go ahead.
Good morning, Siddhartha. I just want to really appreciate the haiku. My house burned down. I can see better the rising moon. But sir, ongoingly as an awakened person or a person in a journey of being awakened, can I keep creating and recreating crises for myself to keep that deeper inquiry ongoing? And at the same time, be detached, not to get flooded with that pain that it would bring. The crisis always brings you discomfort. So, is there a way that I can balance कि आज का जो सच है वो कल का झूठ हो सकता है, बहुत बड़ा झूठ हो सकता है, और आज का जो झूठ है कल बहुत बड़ा सच हो सकता है. So I want to understand one thing is that can I ongoingly create a crisis in my life, attaching to the pain it will bring, and it will take me to a growth and an inquiry. Thank you, sir.
Well, I suppose you can keep burning your house down if you want to, but no, but apart, well, not literally. But I think, see what, I think the possibility being held out by Krishnamurti is, as I understand it, that, one can live lightly with the things of the world. And usually the things of the world weigh too much in our own lives, even when they are things that give us pleasure, and maybe especially when they are things that give us pleasure. Now, Krishnaji was no ascetic. He appreciated good things, right? And he lived well. But I think he lived well with a quality of lightness. From whatever I've read about him, and whatever I have seen, I think, I mean, it's not that one has to give up everything, but is there a different way with which one can relate to the things which seem to define our lives? Our possessions, our families, our work, our sense of identity, all of those things. Those are all realities. All of those are there in the world. But is there a different way of relating with them? I think that's the question that's being raised. And if one is relating with them differently, then one isn't creating a crisis from moment to moment. A crisis, after all, the word crisis itself suggests an exceptional situation. Now, again, to take the example of Krishnaji, it didn't seem to me that he was lurching from crisis to crisis. I think there was, as I said, a certain way with which he was relating to everything, whether it was people or possessions. And he didn't jettison either. So I think it has to do with the quality of being. Yeah, sorry.
So, sir, you mean to say the fundamental questions that I'm raising to myself today need a change with a deeper inquiry, right?
No, how can I say that? I don't know what the questions that you are raising for yourself are, and who am I to say that your questions need to change? I think it depends on where your questions are coming from. And, Krishnaji said, it's good to ask questions. But he said, inquire into the question, he said. And I think usually what we want to do is we very quickly are seeking answers. And usually the answers we seek are verbal. We want clarity at that level, which is why I think he said it's important to stay with the question and not quickly find verbal answers to them.
I think, Savitaji, I just want to add to what Siddharth said. Normally when, one reads Krishna and where he says that please stay with the question, the first response is, I stay with it and do what? But if you just stay for a while, it begins to reveal different perspectives of the same problem. If you're not really very keen to find an answer right away and stay with it, see what happens. Something comes up. So I think one have to have that patience to stay with the question for a little while rather than, looking for an answer immediately. I think Dr. Gajanan Rao has unmuted himself. Sir, say something. Can we hear us now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank God. Yes.
Okay. Is it on the pad? I think I have also lost the opportunity to hear people because trying to motivate that.
Sir, we can see two videos. If you can stop one, we can hear more clearly perhaps.
Yes, I stopped one.
Yes, sir.
But this was something I was going to say. What's happening?
Yeah, this is better now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was really going to say something important, which has gone really blank with all the drama I was making. I lost quite a bit of what people were answering, and Siddharth was saying. It was unfortunate. I shall be careful next time. I'm not very good at this gadget, so there are too many with them. Well, there's an interesting story I'll let you know, because we've been too serious on this matter of arriving or changing or mutating and so on. During independence struggle, you don't mind this, I suppose, Siddharth, you don't think this is being little out of the way. During the struggle of independence, people are very, very active. Particularly when the crisis was on and we were being very sad about being shackled and denied our freedom. A man reaches another man's house early in the morning about coffee time. They're friends. He says, hey, come out. He said, what happened? He says, don't you know something happened dreadfully? What? He said, the Jallianwala Bagh, 1,000 people were shot, man, at a time. The other comes and says, oh my God, is it true? Oh yes. But can I have a cup of coffee now? So after all the serious reporting, the other man has this to say immediately, even without a second gap, come, let's go and have a cup of coffee now. You see the joke? There was hardly the right response to something that happened very serious. So when that's why some people said, particularly I'm ashamed to say, South was more quiet. It is that I have not quoted anywhere. North was more active. It delayed our independence because we took it for 200 years to be slaves. And we are taking endless time to be not being out of freedom now, of the past, all the past a million years. It's not easy, of course, but then Krishnaji is saying it's possible. Not every time require Thomas Alva Edison to come and switch on your light. He has given it and it is there for you to use as easily as possible. Now, that's my question, that as you were yourself saying to Vijay, staying with would mean a very active thing to do. Staying with, you're really hounded by the question. Maybe doing ordinarily things, not that you become morose and not answer anybody. The sensitivity demands the question is being attended to all the time. And when that kind of a thing happens, you are in the present. You're not gone away from it. So whatever happens, even if you let some time chronologically, you're still in the present when you're active. And it may happen, you don't know how, provided you're serious. Serious being, you said it, you want to do it. You thought it, you want to say it. Not there's a disconnect between these. So the good things that Siddhartha Menon was saying was really very nice talk. It was neat, given our difficulties and expectation of Krishnaji. And Krishnaji thought there are only few got the question, the others haven't, and it doesn't rule out the chance of anybody. Only one is serious. So it is sometimes when you read and you're familiar with what he's saying, you have a feeling you got it. At times you're assertive about certain facts or dimensions, people, then it sort of annoys you and jerks you and says, am I really, have I got it to be talking all this? Then these talks cannot happen unless we get out of that shyness. As we are exploring, we also know that we don't have it. But it is not that it is denied to us completely. So let us be active with all the question series. Humanity may have a chance to be better, different. And I'm glad there are schools run by you people, Beji, Siddharth, and so many are involved in it. The younger generation, which may be less conditioning, maybe same conditioning, but children are born with some conditioning. But if children are just born, I always said that even last time, they're in the cradle, you suddenly see them smiling. I don't know what they're thinking. And when I heard Krishnaji say once, so before they lose innocence, they are without. So we can probably reach a state of discarding a lot of accumulations we have made. To be simple, accumulations have to drop. The past have to be dropped. And as he said, Siddhartha said, with question of death itself, it's already going around. I lost my own teacher, great teacher, K.V. Thiruvengadam in Chennai. I used another guru to me like Krishnaji. But then, 94, he was like a young person thinking, saying things, and fresh with whatever is latest. Such a mind he had. And I suppose such minds, unfortunately, I'm not saying he was wrong or something, it was too much. We see it sometimes too much with academics, too much with the experiments we're doing in the laboratory, too much with, say, an actor, acting and his popularity and so on. In fact, talent is an enemy. Krishnaji occasionally pointed out to your really getting to that. Because talent needs popularity. Talent wants popularity to thrive. You will forget the rest of the things. So all human beings, provided they know, come to know, by deeply thinking as they are alone or with people, they don't want images to interfere into anything that they want to get at. So less images, less complicated we are, and more simple we are. It's not something to achieve. Krishnaji gave a clue. You see, and that is all you need to do. Can you see piercingly, sharply, not vaguely? And you may want to see it again to know whether it was. So it's like a photograph. Krishnaji practically taught it to children. See, the flower, the color, the fragrance, and each one, and then pass to the next. So observation is, I think, the real sheet anchor or real principal point in our lives. When you observe very keenly, things do happen. And not that it's happened to him, saying it might have even happened, we don't know. To get rid of a habit, let's say, to be keenly observed as the habit is repeated every day, the whole drama of it. So I may say smile without even meaning it. I may say something in praise of somebody without meaning it. All these small things can leave. Person get a little more serious. And as I don't know really, Siddharth said that maybe I missed it in this drama of this in this thing of trying to get back to you to say a few words. I should have not really minded that and heard you better. I'm sorry. Last bit I missed. Siddharth, it was a very good talk, sir. It was a very good talk, and you were answering questions, made us really very clear. So, you die.
Thank you, sir.
So, to die to something. I have this, maybe not a habit. Somebody has scolded me bitterly. Somebody rough handling. I didn't like it then. When I see that person again, honestly, that doesn't come the first picture between me and him. I don't know why. It may be a kind of a luck or a gift or whatever, or aberration. I see him. Then he tells me again of something. I really fall in love with him. He's not the man who I met before. These things pass before us every day, a number of times. I suppose we have to see and get ourselves less burdened with the past, which is really denying the present. And in the present, if something should happen, it may be happen. There is a chance, however slender. That's what I mean to say. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Thanks a lot. If we have more questions, we can pass it on to Siddharth.
Yeah, sir, this is Balram. Can I have a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a observation make to Siddharth Menon, sir. Sir, you know, I have heard you, and what I gathered from the discussion, you have spent a considerable time in studying Krishnamurti, and moreover, you have also studied in the school also. And I trust and I believe that we have gone through a lot of his books, and perhaps for this talk also you might have taken some minutes to prepare for it also to. So what I want to understand from you is that is this the questions which you have raised to us? Is it your questions or the points you have raised? Is it that you are also dealing with, or you have just made it for us so that we can explore and find it out? What in other way, what I want to understand from you, is there a way of living without raising a question, or this is the way so far? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think both very good questions. The first question, there were several points within that first question. And it's true, I've been in the Krishnamurti world for a long time as a student and as a teacher. But I have to admit that I've read much less than you perhaps imagine I have. There are a few books that I've read that I tend to come back to over and over because they touch me in some way. So the extent of my knowledge of Krishnaji's writing is not very vast. But but I should also say one thing, which is that when I read Krishnaji, when I pick up a book or a dialogue, it almost seems to me as if in one page, everything that he's speaking about is there in one way or the other. Yeah, you see, Krishnamurti, as far as I understand, from whatever I have understood of his life and his thinking, was not a systematic philosopher whom you study in a, again, in a linear way. That word came up earlier. I think it's a very useful and interesting word. I think there were perceptions that he was sharing, and that these perceptions are all very closely interconnected. And so when you encounter one part of this tapestry, you're really in contact with the whole thing. I think with Krishnaji, it's not the case that the more you read, the more you'll understand. I really don't think so. Another part of your first question was, what way did I prepare for today's session? Of course, I did prepare. The questions I've raised are definitely questions for me. They're questions which have arisen or become, let us say, in some sense, urgent or obvious because of this current COVID situation. And these questions about inquiry are again questions which have stayed with me, which have been with me for a long time. So for example, when he asks, can you look at something? As I said, that for me, that question is a childhood memory. And as I've said, I don't know if today I'm any closer to answering that, even for myself, than when I first heard the question. There are some questions that seem to just stay with you. And I feel that, you see, I'm not an academician. I haven't studied Krishnamurti in any kind of formal way. And if at all I'm asked to sort of lead a discussion like today, the only way I can do it is to raise questions which have been of importance to me. So I would say the questions I've raised today are questions which are true to me, and I was hoping they might have some interest for others also. I know that there are some people who would be able to do this very spontaneously because they're living with these questions all the time. I'm not sure that I would have the confidence to do it in a clear way, which is why for me, preparing for a session becomes important. I have to gather my thoughts because otherwise I'll waste everybody's time, because I'll be trying to gather my thoughts when everyone is present. So that was your first question. And sorry, could you remind me of the second one again?
Yeah, the second question is that this is the way of living, sir. Do we need to live the life till end with this question, answer, inquiry, or we can start living somewhere without having a question or seeking an answer?
See, I think that having a question and seeking an answer are perhaps two different things. As I think Krishnaji was pointing out, I think he was saying it's important to stay with the question rather than to seek an answer. And it seems to me that, when one stays with questions, that maybe makes for a certain quality of richness in one's life. Because usually what happens in one's everyday life and one's everyday interactions is one is operating from the known. In one's relationships with people, once one has certain judgments about people, even while one is conversing with them, in the way one deals with problems which arise in day-to-day work or in an institution and so on. Again, very often one is relying heavily on past knowledge, past experience. And of course one does that, and at one level it's necessary to do that. But I think that if there's a quality of tentativeness with which one can hold one's knowledge, and that one part of one's mind is still tentative, seeking, giving value to questions, not in a hurry to find quick answers, then that can be part of one's living. It's not that I'm not looking for a situation in which I have no questions left. It's not that then one will start living. I would say that one is living with and through questions. I think life would be terrible if one had no questions. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's my response.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much indeed.
May I ask a question? Hello.
Anybody else?
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
My question is more direct. This crisis, we all know about it. Even Greta Thunberg mentioned about terrible future about younger generation before heartless world leaders. My question is, Krishnamurti wanted to convey, repeatedly told, not to belong to rotten society. We have all educators, particularly Krishnamurti schools and educators, have failed to convey this message, not to belong to rotten society, maintain the flame of discontent, even add fuel to the fire. That may lead to further initiatives and creative energy. I want Ms. Menon to reply to this.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because as you said, it's a question that when you've been working in a Krishnamurti school for some time, you're really, again, looking at that question all the time. And, it operates in different ways. Very often I'm asked this question, this is all very well. You have such a nice school, nice grounds, people are friendly here, teachers are kind, and all of that. But how will our children fit into the world, into the real world? And the real world is assumed to be very different from the world in the school. And in one form or the other, this question keeps coming back. Parents ask it, potential parents ask it. Students don't seem to ask it very much. In fact, I found that students are not so worried about, how they'll fit into what we're calling the real world. But adults are very worried, and naturally, I'm not it's very natural. If I was a parent, I would perhaps ask the same question. And I find that I tend to answer it somewhat differently depending on who is asking it. There are people who, when they're visiting the school, they want to be reassured that their children will not be misfits. That that the Krishnamurti schools are not some kind of an artificial bubble and so on. And so when people ask with that kind of anxiety, I'm usually sort of saying things like, the school is also the real world in many different ways. It's not that, children here are protected in some ways, but they still have to face each other. They still have issues of relationship, of identity, of competition, fear, jealousy, and so on. So many of the real questions that we face everywhere are here as well. And in fact, this whole business of the real world is, I think, a nonsensical term. I think the real world is real everywhere, whether it's in school or outside the school. And therefore, there isn't this sharp distinction that we need to be afraid of. But on the other hand, there's the question, the way it is being asked now, which is, it's not just, are we doing enough for children to be able to move easily into life after school, but are we also helping them to stand out, to not fit into rotten society, which is the way the question was asked? Well, I hope so. But, there are different ways in which that can happen. There's a sort of simplistic way in which one can approach this, which is that you be very critical about everything in society, and you sort of expect your children to be equally critical. And the danger of this is that they can start becoming second-hand, even in their questions and criticism of society. And I think it's, Krishnaji was concerned about conditioning. And I think it's very important that we don't sort of superficially condition our children with some kind of Krishnamurti influence. I think what's important is that the children, when they leave our schools, have a certain comfort with being themselves, so that they are less easily swayed by public opinion, so that they are more capable of questioning the things that they see around them. Now, do we succeed in this? Do all the children who leave the schools have that capacity to question, to stand for themselves, at the same time not to be constantly in conflict with everybody and everything around them? So have we succeeded in this? I don't know. I'd like to think that because these concerns are real and we try to find different ways of keeping these concerns alive for our children and for ourselves as adults, I'd like to think that for a fair number of children, by the time they leave the school, they do have a certain amount of, let us say, self-confidence is not exactly what I want to say. That's a limited term. What I mean is more like a certain degree of comfort with being what they are. And at the same time, a comfort that's not complacent, that's not, taking the world for granted, but that is strong enough to be able to ask questions and stand up for themselves. Also, let me just say that, a phrase like Krishnaji's, when he says, when he speaks about a rotten society, in itself, that's not to tell children that society is rotten is not the way I would like to go about it. Because there are things in society which are rotten, but there are things in society which are not rotten. And I'd like children to be able to discriminate. I'd like them, Dr. Gajanan Rao was speaking a little bit earlier about the importance of looking with clarity. And I think that's the most valuable tool that we can give to our children or hope that they take with them, to be able to look, and to look not just objectively. I think we overrate objectivity, because objectivity is important, but to also see, and I'm sort of misquoting Shakespeare here, to see feelingly, to see with a quality of involvement, feelingly, with feeling, to see with feeling, and yet not to, because mere objectivity to me can be disengagement. You see things, but you're not bothered. I would like us to be able, and our children to be able to see things with concern, with clarity and with concern.
Thank you, Siddharth. Jain sir, we have passed our time. Do you want to take any more question, or what do we do?
Vijay, one last question.
Okay, so there's one more question from Shlok. Please go ahead.
May I ask, this flame of discontent leading to initiative and creative energy, you have not answered that.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that phrase. I would say that, if we are able to see with clarity, the discontent will follow. I think, there is a discontent that can be secondhand, because, adults are discontented with various things that are happening around, and adults have ways of, even if they don't want to, of influencing the way children think. So I think what's important is that we have, and that we help the children to have, the capacity to see things clearly with feeling, and yet not in an emotional kind of way. So when they see that things are not right, there is discontent, but not frustration. Because frustration is like a dead end, whereas where there's discontent, and I think that's a good word, right? There again, you're interested in where that discontent is coming from. And the discontent, again, there's a dynamic between what's happening outside in the world and what's happening within you. So I would like our students, when they're in school and when they leave school, to be able to feel strongly enough about the world to feel discontented, but also to have the capacity to look at their own discontent and to see where it's coming from. The discontent could merely be out of a sense of being thwarted. You don't get what you want, so you're discontented. Now, I don't think that kind of discontent leads very far. It's just a personal thing. So therefore, to also be able to look at one's own discontent, I think, is very important.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thanks a lot.
Vijay, one last question.
Okay. We are way past our time. Please let it be the last question. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Siddharth, can I inquire? Yes, sir. Siddharth?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Sir, there is this awareness that we see in Jiddu Krishnamurti, or as we are understanding it, which seems to be so heightened that even the mundane becomes so vitally absorbed. And here we are placed in a situation of inquiry, as I understand. There seems to be some difference, if that is how I'm imagining, of Krishnamurti's awareness and our inquiries.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think it may be related in some way. This is just a quick response, so I'm not sure at all. But it may be related to what you yourself had mentioned earlier when you made a distinction between, let us say, a linear way of looking at the world and a non-linear one. And you see, when we use the word awareness, we tend to understand it as being a non-linear process. It seems to be like being open, to everything that's happening. Whereas when we use the word inquiry, we tend to see it as being directed. You know, we inquire towards something, we want some goal and so on. So I think that for Krishnaji, there's perhaps no distinction between the two. I think inquiry is awareness in some sense. Now, this may seem like I'm just taking a sort of easy way out of what I think is a very valuable question, but I do think that that's where we need to look really. I think that that quality of awareness, when it becomes part of your way of living, that itself, you know, then it draws in inquiry. Inquiry is not separate from that. And in that situation, then I think inquiry doesn't become a linear process. I think it's also something which is three-dimensional, if you like. So this is just a very tentative and hesitant answer to your question, but maybe we need to inquire into it further.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Jain Saab, can we close it now?
Yes, sir. I remain discontented, so I will ask him one to one to say his poem to me. So please do whatever you like.
Yes, we'll ask him to be on speaker one more time later on. Yes, certainly.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
with these words, thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Siddharth, for joining us and giving a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Sushilji's poem.
Thank you very
Thank you, everyone. And it was really interesting to have some amazing questions and thank you for being provoked.
Thank you. And next week we are going to have Dr. Scott Forbes. He was principal of Brockwood Park School after Mary Simons. So I hope that will be an interesting lecture too. You are all welcome to join us next Monday at the same time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sushilji's poem.
Yeah.
Yes. Please go ahead.
No, sir. No, I am not. I am asking from him to say his own poems. He is poet. That's why I asked him. But he said for someone else, he said that this. So I will have one-to-one if nobody is interested in that.
We can have a full session on Siddharth poems because he has written 3 books and they have been published from very reputed publishers. So we can have one more session purely on Siddharth poems.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I wouldn't
Thank you,
advise you to
Siddharth, sir.
attend it.
It was a great lecture, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dubey, sir.
Thank you.